The original Metroid Prime is one of the most beloved games of all time. Initially released in 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube, Prime took the classic 2D Metroid formula into full 3D, giving Samus an open-ended world packed with puzzles to master and enemies to defeat. It pushed visual boundaries for the period as well, with dense, moody environments and a solid 60 FPS framerate target. Prime has been stuck on standard definition hardware for over 20 years now, with official versions only available for the GameCube and Wii. But that's all changed with the surprise announcement and release of Metroid Prime Remastered for the Nintendo Switch. This new version is essentially a complete visual remake of the source material, retaining the same basic gameplay, but with radically overhauled graphics. So in this video, we'll be breaking down Metroid Prime Remastered in depth, covering the graphics tech, control changes, image quality, performance, and gameplay, alongside plenty of comparisons with the original game. Metroid Prime Remastered on the surface seems like a pretty straightforward remake effort. Essentially, Retro Studios and co-developer Iron Galaxy seem to have taken the original Metroid Prime code and gotten it to run within a newer version of Retro's in-house game engine. The underlying gameplay logic seems very similar, and the game content is basically identical, though we'll touch on some of the differences in playability a little bit later. But Remastered really distinguishes itself with the sheer quality of the visuals on display. The new visual design feels faithful to the original work, but massively expands fidelity and rendering complexity to a level that we rarely see from Switch games. I'm using footage from the Wii version of Metroid Prime for our comparisons, to keep aspect ratios matching between the two games. Remastered's new lighting is its most impressive aspect. The original Metroid Prime's lighting was good for the period, but was very limited by 6th gen console hardware, and tended to look a little bit flat. Metroid Prime Remastered has basically gone all in on a sophisticated baked lighting solution for environmental lighting. There's beautiful light propagation through each area, with very pleasing balance, subtle shadowing, and plenty of fog. Areas seem much more lifelike now, and the lighting really makes each area look and feel integrated in a way that we really don't see from very many Switch games. The visual design of each area has been updated to really make this new lighting system shine. In a lot of cases, new light sources have been added, and existing objects in the world have been given emissive properties. There's even static volumetric style lighting present in many spots, and even though it doesn't seem to be proper real-time volumetric lighting, it still looks quite convincing. Materials also exhibit accurate lighting response. Metroid Prime has a lot of dense, naturalistic environments, and the stonework, trees, and foliage all look roughly correct. There isn't too much specularity here, but environments like the downed frigate also showcase good-looking reflectivity across artificial surfaces. There is one caveat here though. In the original Metroid Prime, beam weapons cast dynamic lights throughout the environment when you fired them. This did have some limitations. The GameCube hardware didn't support per pixel lighting, so these effects were vertex-based, which could look awkward at times, but they did make the world feel more reactive to player input. Metroid Prime Remastered mostly lacks these effects. Perhaps this sort of player-driven dynamic lighting wouldn't play well with the game's overall lighting system, or maybe performance concerns meant that this had to be cut. In some smaller corridors, you can see a limited approximation of this effect, but most of the time it's completely missing. Remastered's lighting in general looks beautiful and is a massive step up from the original release, but this concession is worth noting. Metroid Prime's models and textures have also been completely remade for this version. Prime's original asset work looked good for the period, with impressive geometric density and solid texture work, but it doesn't hold up too well to modern scrutiny. The new environments are much more detailed. Models now have a fair bit of polygonal complexity, and sport refined textures that work effectively within the game's lighting pipeline. Every asset from the original seems to have been completely remade to suit the capabilities of the Switch hardware, and a ton of incidental detail has been added. Remastered does do a good job of keeping things in a sort of rough alignment with the original game. All the major bits of geometry from the original game are represented in Remastered, so area designs feel faithful enough even though they've been overhauled with brand new artwork. There's a bit of a cliche about remakes showing you a game as you remember it, but not as it actually was, and I think that sentiment holds especially true here. Everything feels very familiar, despite the massive improvement in fidelity. Most of the novel effects from the original game have been replicated here too. The first-person visor still fogs up and can get covered in guts and electricity. When using certain weapons, Samus's face is reflected in the visor material itself, which is another great touch that's carried over from the original. The helmet interior responds to environmental lighting and is also now affected by player weapons fire too, lighting up as you fire the various beam projectiles. Water behaves in much the same way as the original release as well. Raindrops collide with the player weapon, though this time they leave rain trails on the cannon itself too. The geometry-based water ripple effect from the original has been replicated, alongside more intricate deformation in smaller pools of water. Surface detail on the water itself looks much more pleasing now, with normal mapped ripples and cube map based reflections, though the cube maps do fall out of alignment fairly easily. Speaking of reflections, I did notice that the glossy domes in the Chozo Ruins area no longer reflect Samus. These surfaces definitely look better in the remake overall with a plausible looking cube map based reflection, but Samus is nowhere to be found. In the original game, this seemed to be based on a simple texturing trick, and replicating this at a suitable level of fidelity in a modern graphics engine would be expensive, so its absence is understandable. Metroid Prime Remastered is at its core a port of the original game, so it makes sense that the animation data from the 2002 release has largely been reused. Enemy animation appears to largely be a match for the source material, and cutscenes basically line up one-to-one in object and camera movement. Mostly the original work holds up just fine here though. It helps that enemies are stylized and have dramatic proportions, so the sort of exaggerated movement with simpler canned animations doesn't feel too off-putting. I did notice some small tweaks as well, like a gentler, more naturally keyframed camera in this cutscene, though some of the awkwardness from the original remains in other scenes. Metroid Prime was renowned for its approach to first-person animation. This essentially revolved around a few subtle touches. Visor movement lagged slightly behind the player camera, for instance, the player weapon bobbed up and down as you moved through each area, and the camera would angle down when jumping to make first-person platforming feel more natural. Some of this hasn't survived the transition into Metroid Prime Remastered. The visor movement is intact, but the weapon bobbing has been toned down quite a bit. As a result, simple traversal tends to feel a little bit less tactile than in the original game. Some extra weapon or camera bobbing would have helped here, though this will come down to personal preference. By default, the camera no longer tilts down when jumping to help with platforming either, though this seems to stem from changes made to Remastered's controls. By default, the game now uses full dual-stick camera controls that basically mirror the control scheme of any other modern first-person game. The lock-on combat system returns, of course, and the fire button is mapped to both the Z, R, and A buttons, but it's otherwise in line with contemporary shooter conventions. That means you have control over the firing position of Samus's cannon at all times, so forcing the reticle to move downwards while jumping would probably feel pretty awkward. The GameCube version used the left stick for traversal and gun control, and you had to lock yourself in place to aim manually, which sidestepped this issue. The camera also doesn't tilt downwards while jumping in the Wii release, so this seems to be a long-standing change to accommodate free camera movement in newer versions of Metroid Prime. If you prefer, you can switch to an approximation of the original control scheme, though the tank controls don't feel particularly intuitive after so many years of standard dual-stick controls in console shooters. On the plus side, the camera tilting is present with this control option, just like the original. You can also swap to a pointer control gyroscope-based option that essentially mirrors the controls used in Metroid Prime's Wii re-release, which is fine, I suppose, if you're into that sort of thing. There's also a final hybrid option that uses the classic control scheme alongside a gyroscope-based free aim mode. Personally, I'm mostly stuck with the dual-stick controls. They felt more natural to me and allow you to explore environments more quickly, without needing to stop and enter free aim. Again though, the two control options that allow for manual camera control at all times, the dual stick and pointer control choices, strip back a bit of first-person animation for playability. On the image quality front, Metroid Prime Remastered does have some faults, but the results are pretty good on the whole. The basic resolution figures are reasonable enough, especially when it comes to advanced Switch software. In docked mode, the game appears to render at 900p, with no signs of dynamic resolution in my testing. Portable mode came in at 600p for me, again with no signs of dynamic res. The key caveat here is that Remastered doesn't appear to use any anti-aliasing whatsoever. I couldn't spot any significant treatment on geometric edges. For the most part, this doesn't stand out too badly though in this particular game. Certain real-time graphical features, especially SSAO and shadow maps, would suffer from a lot of aliasing with this sort of setup, but their pre-computed alternatives blend nicely into the image without shimmering or distortion. Most of the environments are pretty light on specular elements as well, which again helps to minimize aliasing in the basic game artwork. There are some spots that do suffer from more considerable aliasing, mostly in metallic artificial structures, but elsewhere the results generally look fine. Performance is very straightforward, which is a good thing. I didn't spot any noticeable framerate dips across my testing, with a locked 60 FPS throughout. Heavy combat didn't cause any issues, even in very taxing particle-filled fights. It's perfectly possible that the game could drop frames of course, but if so, it's quite rare. Portable mode fares much the same, at least judging by eye, with a perfectly smooth 60 FPS update. Remastered really shines in portable play, especially on the OLED Switch model, where the darker hues of the revamped lighting really pop. The mildly sub-native presentation is scarcely an issue. Remastered just looks awesome on a 7-inch screen. Loading times are virtually non-existent in Remastered as well. There is a short initial load, but outside of that and some brief loading cutscenes during elevator rides, there are zero interruptions to the experience. That was famously true of the original game as well to an extent, but you often had to wait a few moments around doors waiting for them to open as the game fetched data, which never happens in the new version. Metroid Prime is still a fantastic game. Traversing through an unknown hostile environment, searching for power-ups and solving environmental puzzles, it all still feels fresh and exciting some 2 decades on. The original game is one of my favorite titles from the 6th gen console era, and everything I enjoyed about it when I played it back in 2003 when I was 8 years old is perfectly preserved here. That does mean that some of the quirks of the original game, like a heavy reliance on backtracking and a slightly unforgiving save system, are intact as well, though in some ways, I think it's a bit of a refreshing change of pace from the hand-holding that we see in most big budget releases today. The control tweaks at least make the game feel much more in tune with modern sensibilities, so this is the most inviting way to experience Metroid Prime in the modern era. The visual improvements help enormously as well, of course. Metroid Prime is a beautiful Switch game that makes clever use of the hardware to deliver a visually sophisticated experience while still hitting a rock-solid 60 FPS framerate target. This is one of the best looking Switch titles that I've seen, and it shows just what the Tegra X1 based console is capable of when carefully catered to in an exclusive title. Remastered feels very true to the source game, despite the massive graphical leap as well, closely hewing to the original visual language while filling out and expanding every conceivable detail. Retro's overall approach reminds me a lot, oddly enough, of Halo 2 Anniversary. That title also took a 6th gen console game and brought it up to a top-class visual standard while still respecting the source material. There are some similar looking environments between the two games as well. If anything, Prime Remastered might even be a cut above that effort, owing to the sophistication of its lighting. Other Halo games, Halo 4 in particular, also feel like good points of reference for the general visual look that Remastered is aiming for, although I do feel that more recent Halo games drew a lot of inspiration from the Prime titles, so there may be a bit of cross-pollination there. As Retro Studios' first proper game release in a very long time, the initial Wii U version of Tropical Freeze launched all the way back in 2014. This is a remarkably accomplished effort that shows the developer still firing on all cylinders. The strength of this game, and in particular the technology that powers it, is of special interest to a lot of people, since Retro is also slated to deliver Metroid Prime 4 after taking over the project some 4 years ago. A lot seems to be up in the air about that particular project, but this level of visual fidelity would really suit a new Prime title. Retro's in-house graphics engine seems to have been significantly enhanced, all the while retaining a firm grip on the 60 FPS frame rate target that has defined the mainline Metroid Prime games. Metroid Prime Remastered is a more approachable, beautifully refined take on the 6th gen original that still manages to hold up as a stunning game on its own terms. Remastered is a top quality modernization of a classic game, and it's well worth your time. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.